Picture this. It's 2014. You're sitting at home, maybe you're a little bored, scrolling through Instagram when you find a woman who stops your scrolling. She's young, she's beautiful, she's glowing, and she's writing about the day a doctor told her she had only 4 months to live. She's diagnosed with terminal brain cancer, malignant and inoperable, and she's just 20 years old. She describes the moment her world stopped, the suffocating feeling in that doctor's office, leaving and not remembering how she got home, sitting with the diagnosis that was supposed to end her life before it had even started. But then, and here's the part that really hooks you into her story, she decided not to accept it. She walked away from chemotherapy, she walked away from radiotherapy, she chose instead to heal herself through food, through whole, natural, unprocessed ingredients, through patience and community, and something she just called love. And it worked. She's here, alive, radiant, and running a business while raising her son and donating 25% of her profits to charity, because surviving taught her that giving back is everything. You share the post and your friends share it. Someone with cancer shares it and says that it gives them hope when nothing else could. But there is just one problem. The woman never had cancer. Not even a trace of it. Not then, not now, not ever. The story, every word of it was invented. And the charity money? It was all a lie too. This is the Scareful Story of Belle Gibson. Hi, and welcome back to the channel. Here, I tell Scareful Stories, which are stories to make you think, make you a little scared, and maybe, just maybe, make you a little more careful. If you want to support the channel, the best way is to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, and share the video. If you're really feeling generous, feel free to buy me a coffee. And now, onto the story of Belle Gibson. Before we get into how the scam worked with Belle Gibson, we need to understand why it worked. Because this isn't just the story about one dishonest person. It's about a moment in history when conditions were absolutely perfect for exactly Belle's kind of lie. It was the early 2010s, Instagram was new, the concept of a wellness influencer barely had a name yet, but something was happening, a massive growing cultural rebellion against conventional medicine. The pitch went something like this. Doctors don't know everything. Pharmaceutical companies have a financial incentive to keep you dependent. What you put in your body matters more than any pill, and if you eat clean, live intentionally, and trust your instincts, you can heal things that medicine says are beyond hope. Some of that, in small ways, has some truth to it. But the wellness industry now, back in the 2010s, and even before that, has a way of stretching those ideas into something more dangerous. I think you can see this kind of thing throughout history, these wellness gurus. There were people back in the day selling magic elixirs out of the back of a truck or with a horse and buggy and selling the perfect tonic that would solve all your health problems. And you saw in the 70s a real move towards natural foods and alfalfa sprouts and vegetarianism. But I think what changed now and in that 2010 period was the internet and, more importantly, social media and the very beginnings of the wellness influencers. It's just a much quicker way of spreading people's stories and information in a way that hadn't been known to humankind before this. And the wellness industry, combined with social media, still has a particularly powerful grip on people, and especially on people who are frightened, like people dealing with cancer, chronic illnesses, and conditions that conventional medicine have struggled to address. And here's the thing about the fear that people have. When you're frightened enough, when the official answer from doctors and the medical community is, we can't do much more to help you, you will reach for almost anything that offers an alternative. And the wellness industry understands that. It's built upon that. And these aren't people who are looking for recipes on Instagram. We're talking about people who are looking for hope. And it's into this world that a young woman named Belle Gibson walked into with exactly the story they needed to hear. Belle's full name is Annabelle Natalie Gibson. She was born in 1991 and raised in Tasmania and later in Brisbane, Australia. She was a high school dropout and a teen mom. By her early 20s, she was raising a young son largely on her own. She'd had a difficult childhood, and she would later talk about it frequently in the kind of detail that made her followers love her even more. She said she had a mother with multiple sclerosis and a brother with autism. She told stories about standing on a chair to reach the stovetop at age 6 to cook for her family. She said she was the household's primary carer before she was old enough to even have a proper bedtime. But here's something that a lot of people don't know. Her brother, in interviews later after the scandal broke, denied virtually all of it. But now we're getting ahead of ourselves. The detail that mattered, and the one that started everything, was the cancer story. Around 2009, Belle started telling people she'd been diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. She said a doctor gave her only 4 months to live. She said she tried conventional treatment, hated the side effects, and eventually walked away to heal herself naturally. Turned that story into a business. If you were scrolling through Instagram in 2013, you may have landed on Belle Gibson's feed. The photographs alone would have stopped you. Everything was beautiful. Sunlit bowls of whole grains and roasted vegetables, fresh herbs scattered on wooden boards, a young woman who looks genuinely like the picture of health, and underneath every photo was her story. I was told I had months to live. I chose to heal myself. Here's what I made for dinner. Her account at Healing Belle grew fast, and then faster still. Later that year, she launched an app called the Whole Pantry, which provided whole food recipes, wellness content, and a community platform. Apple's own review team called it the best food and drink app of the year. It had 200,000 downloads in its first month alone. But here's the thing that made the Whole Pantry feel like something more than just a recipe app. Belle had made a promise. She announced that 25% of all profits would go to charity. She named specific causes, including cancer research, children in need, and some humanitarian organizations. And she wove that into every campaign, every launch, and every caption. Buying this app isn't just buying a recipe, it's an act of generosity. People responded to that, and of course they did. They weren't just getting recipes, they were part of something. In 2014, Belle signed a book deal with Penguin. The cookbook version of the Whole Pantry was promoted at the London Book Fair and scheduled for release in the US and the UK. Elle Australia ran a profile headlining "The Most Inspiring Woman You've Met This Year." Cosmopolitan gave her its Fun Fearless Female Award. Now think about what each of those things did for Belle's credibility. Every media mention, every award, every profile made the next one easier to get. She wasn't just a blogger anymore. She was someone that Penguin believed in, and someone that Cosmopolitan was celebrating. Someone that editors and publishers and PR teams had looked at and decided was worth their name. Each endorsement was a kind of verification. Technically, not of her medical history, because nobody checked that, but people also didn't know that nobody had checked that. It made people trust her story, her vibe, and her brand. And once enough credible institutions had associated themselves with her, questioning her started to feel almost rude. And then came the call that turned her from an Australian success story into a global phenomenon. Apple called. They were preparing to launch the Apple Watch, the very first version of the Apple Watch, and they wanted the Whole Pantry to be one of its debut apps. They wanted it featured and showcased and endorsed by Apple itself. Think about what that meant. Apple's engineers, Apple's marketing team, and the Apple brand itself, all of them implicitly were vouching for Belle Gibson's story. And if Apple believed her, why would anybody else doubt her? She was at that moment untouchable. But now here's where things get a little uncomfortable. And it's important not to rush past it because it's easy to say that people were fooled and leave it there, but who was fooled matters enormously. Sure, Belle had casual followers and health enthusiasts who just liked her recipes, but there were also people who were genuinely very sick, real cancer patients who found Belle's account during the scariest chapters of their lives, people sitting in oncology waiting rooms, scrolling through their phones, looking for anything that felt like hope. And Belle's story told them someone survived this, someone chose nature over medicine and won, and maybe it made them think, maybe I can too. Some of those people made decisions based on what Belle said. We don't know exactly how many, and we don't know what happened to all of them, but there's one story from inside Belle's personal circle that makes all of it concrete. In the early days of her rise, Belle befriended a Melbourne woman named Penny Schwartz. Penny's young son Joshua had been diagnosed with brain cancer, not fake cancer, but real brain cancer, the kind that required real treatment, real fundraising, real financial sacrifice from a family trying to save their child's life. Belle approached Penny as a survivor, someone who understood, someone who'd been given the same terrifying diagnosis and come out the other side. The families grew close, and their children had play dates together. Belle wrote about Joshua in her cookbook. She called him the second little man after my own heart. She described their bond as an unended friendship with our brain bugs. She offered Penny a printed invitation to my love and support. Belle also told her followers that she was fundraising for Joshua's treatment. Penny later told journalists that she had no idea she was even in the cookbook and that she never gave her consent. She also said that she didn't know Belle had been raising money in her son's name until reporters called to ask about it. When Penny contacted Belle for an explanation, Belle was evasive. And when the story broke publicly, online trolls flooded Joshua's actual fundraising page, the real one, the one his own family had set up to pay for his ongoing treatment. There were accusations that the family had been in on Belle's con. Strangers posted the most horrendous things, Penny said, on the medical blogs where she had been documenting her son's fight. This was a family with a child dying of cancer who was targeted by internet strangers because of what Belle Gibson set into motion. Joshua Schwartz died in 2020, never having received the money Belle claimed to be raising for him. There was also another Australian wellness inventor at the same time as Belle Gibson, a woman named Jess Ansco, known online as the Wellness Warrior. Jess also had a real cancer diagnosis, and like Belle, she publicly rejected conventional treatment in favor of alternative therapies. She built a large following as a result. She died in February of 2015 at only 29 years old. Belle Gibson attended her funeral. She wept and performed grief, publicly and visibly, for a woman who had the disease that she only pretended to have. That takes a lot of nerve. I mean, Belle's sitting there pretending to be sad about just dying from cancer while pretending to have cancer and pretending to have been cured by cancer. It's just really an awful thing. When did the cracks start to show in Belle's story? So it's back in 2014. Belle is at the peak of her fame. She has an Apple Watch partnership, a Penguin cookbook, and international attention. And then she posts something on Facebook. Belle posts that her cancer has spread. It's now in her uterus, her spleen, her liver, her kidney, and her blood. Her followers respond with an outpouring of love. Prayers, hearts, we're in the fight with you. Fight more, you've beaten this before. But something feels off. It just doesn't seem to fit. Because just a few months later, her cookbook, which had already been printed, was being shipped to booksellers. And in it, Belle states clearly, in her own words, that her cancer had not grown in 2 years. So, not grown in 2 years, or has spread throughout your entire body? Which is it? Had it spread dramatically to 6 organs, or had it been stable for 24 months? Other inconsistencies were beginning to stack up as well. Belle had claimed in various profiles to be 3 years older than she actually was. And her cancer timeline kept shifting depending on when she told the story. One thing she kept out of her stories was that in 2011, 2 years after she'd started telling people she had terminal brain cancer, Belle went to the Alfred Hospital. There, she had a real brain scan by a qualified neurologist who then sat with her for 40 minutes and told her face to face that she had no tumor. She didn't have cancer. There was no evidence of anything malignant. At that point, Belle had been told officially and clearly, and yet she kept telling people that she was dying. Belle's world began to crumble in March of 2015 when a young journalist named Beau Donnelly was at his desk at the Age newspaper in Melbourne when a tip came in. Friends of Belle Gibson, people who knew her personally and not just online, had started talking, and they started to believe that her cancer story wasn't real. Donnelly was early in his career. His colleague Nick Toscano was too. Neither of them knew much about Belle Gibson or the wellness space before that call, but they knew how to ask good questions, and here's where the investigation gets interesting. Proving that someone doesn't have cancer is almost impossible. Medical records are private, and no doctor goes on record saying that a patient lied. Without a single source willing to go on the record, they couldn't print what they suspected. So they did something deceptively simple. They started to call the charities Belle had said she had donated portions of her profits to. Belle had publicly claimed that $300,000 had already been donated to various causes. It was a big part of her branding. Every campaign, every sale, every announcement had a charitable component attached. She'd stated publicly that a large part of everything the company earns is now donated to charities. So Donnelly picked up the phone and started asking the charities, "Did you receive a donation?" He made one call at a time. The Asylum Seekers Resource Center said no. In fact, the organization had already raised the alarm with Consumer Affairs Victoria because they'd been publicly named in a fundraising drive and the money had never arrived. They'd been waiting, but nothing had come. Donnelly and Toscano kept calling, and the picture that emerged was stark. Belle's company had earned over $420,000. She had announced publicly that $300,000 had been donated. The actual figure that reached any charity at all, approximately $7,000. That's $7,000 total from a company that had earned well over $400,000, and that gap was so enormous it could only mean one thing. Belle was lying, and probably not just about the money. It's like when you start pulling a thread on a sweater, the whole thing starts to unravel. The story about the charities never receiving any money ran, and the moment it did, Belle Gibson's empire began visibly seizing up. Apple pulled the whole Pantry app from the watch launch. Penguin pulled the cookbook from shelves. In Australia and internationally, the US and UK releases were canceled overnight. Belle's Instagram went private, and posts started disappearing. The carefully constructed feed of sunlit recipes and cancer survivor wisdom was just gone, as though it had never existed. Under mounting pressure, Belle gave an interview to the newspaper The Australian, acknowledging that some of her cancer claims might have resulted from a misdiagnosis. So, not a lie, she was saying, but a misdiagnosis. She still didn't seem to be quite ready to admit the whole thing was a lie. But the people around her were done covering for her. Some of the very friends thanked by name in her cookbook, people who had believed in her, defended her, and built communities around her, started speaking to journalists. The private doubts that had been circulating for months finally went public. It just seems amazing to me that you'd think these people who were close to her, wouldn't they start to wonder why she never brought anybody to the doctor with her? Most people I know who have had cancer or have a lot of health struggles bring a husband, a boyfriend, a friend with them to the doctor, not necessarily to every visit, but certainly to something like chemotherapy. They're not necessarily driving themselves home. And so I would think that people would start to wonder why she always wanted to go by herself, right? Like, what kind of excuses could she possibly have been giving for that people would actually buy? Because most really good friends would insist on going along with you, whether you wanted to or not, or they would let you go alone, but then they would show up on their own to be supportive of you. And that's not even getting into that, did she ever lose her hair, or did she ever lose weight? Did she ever start to look like she was actually sick? Or was she always this perfect picture of health and we were just all supposed to believe that it was because she was eating healthy? But then it kind of like she blows her own story, because she says, well, I cured myself by eating healthy, but oh, by the way, not really, because now my cancer is spread even more. And I'm sure that in her head, it would seem believable that yet again, somehow she's going to beat this cancer that's all over her body. But that would really make people start to wonder, as if the brain cancer wasn't enough. But I have a feeling that for Belle, she needs a constant source of attention, and that her way of getting attention is lying and making up these fantastical stories and not really caring about who it hurts in the process. But getting back to the story, sorry for the little tangent there, but it turns out that one of the other things Belle lied about was her age. She was 3 years younger than she'd told almost everyone. A person who had built her identity around her own story had been lying about something as basic as her age. In April of 2015, the Australian Women's Weekly ran what became one of the most jaw-dropping celebrity interviews in Australian media history. The headline was, "My lifelong struggle with the truth." Like, yeah, no kidding. The reporter asked Belle point blank, "Did you have brain cancer?" "No," Belle said, "none of it's true." And just like that, she told the truth. There were no tears, no elaborate explanation, and no apology. Belle said, "I don't want forgiveness. I just think speaking out was the responsible thing to do. Above anything, I would like people to say, okay, she's human." She had just admitted to building an entire empire on a lie she'd been telling since she was a teenager, and the thing she wanted most was for people to say that she was human. Like, just brush past the fact that she'd been lying and stealing money from people. But hey, that's okay. And giving cancer patients false hope. But hey, she's human just like the rest of us. A few months later, Belle agreed to sit down with 60 Minutes Australia and reporter Tara Brown. And I have to say, go find this on YouTube and watch this. It is such an amazing interview. I love Tara Brown. I love 60 Minutes Australia for some reason. I don't live in Australia. Clearly, I live in the United States. But I really, really love that show. They have some really great stories on there. And Tara Brown just seems like a great interviewer. And if you're into body language and evaluating body language, go watch the Behavior Panel and their analysis of this interview and Belle Gibson. They have some really good insight into Belle. It's really fascinating. What came out of that interview was somehow even stranger than the original lie. Belle arrived with a new explanation. She claimed that she had genuinely believed she was dying, that a man named Mark Johns, who she said was an immunologist and neurologist that she'd found online, had come to her home in 2009 and diagnosed her with stage 4 brain cancer. Like what? Over a cup of tea? Like just sitting in her living room. She said he used a machine that looked like a box. It had lights on the front and was German technology. It measured frequencies. The box had 2 metal pads. One went below her chair and one went behind your back. Mark Johns told her she had 4 months to live and gave her pills he called oral chemotherapy. He brought in scans that showed a tumor. But what scans? Scans from these plates on the chair? 60 Minutes sent researchers to find Mark Johns, and not surprisingly, they couldn't find anyone. There were no medical board registrations, no hospital affiliations, no licensing record, and no evidence that this man ever existed at all. And when the reporter noted that Belle's own book said she was diagnosed in a medical office, not in her home, Belle admitted that that was also not true. She'd invented the detail because she didn't think people would understand the reality. And here she was explaining why parts of her lie were lies, while telling a news story that itself was a lie. Then Tara Brown asked, "When you learned definitively that you never had cancer, wasn't that actually good news?" And Belle said no, she was devastated at the news. "I felt like I had been lied to, like I had been taken for a ride." Like so many of her followers, I guess. Belle was paid $45,000 to appear for the interview. She owed hundreds of thousands of dollars at this point in fines, but she was paid $45,000 to explain her lies on television. In 2016, Consumer Affairs Victoria announced formal legal action against Belle. Not criminal action, Australian authorities determined they lacked sufficient evidence for a criminal prosecution, but the case proceeded under consumer law, and she was accused of misleading and deceptive conduct. Belle Gibson did not appear at her own trial. In March of 2017, federal court justice Deborah Mortimer found Belle guilty of 5 charges. The judgment was scathing. Justice Mortimer wrote that Belle had no reasonable basis to believe she had cancer from the time she began making these claims in public. The company had projected the image of a successful, booming enterprise with a wholesale dedication to charitable giving, while funneling almost nothing to the named causes. The fine of 410,000 Australian dollars plus legal costs. The judge suggested that whatever Belle could pay should go directly to the charities she'd claimed to have supported. In that way, she wrote, some good might still come for the vulnerable people and the organizations supporting them, which were indirectly drawn into this unconscionable sequence of events. Vulnerable people, that's the phrase the judge used. And that who was always at the center of this, not necessarily Apple or Penguin, and not the media companies who ran glowing profiles without asking the hard questions, but vulnerable people who were sick and people who were scared, people who believed that if they followed the advice of someone who'd beaten the worst diagnosis imaginable, maybe they too could find a way through their own darkness. And a family in Melbourne whose dying child had money raised in his name without their knowledge and without their consent, and the money never arrived. Those were the people at the center of this story. The fine remains unpaid today. By the time authorities raided Belle's Melbourne home in 2021, the total owed, with penalties and interest, had grown to over $500,000. She told the court that she couldn't afford to pay the fines. She told a news crew who caught her at a gas station in 2024 the same thing. As of 2025, the Victorian Premier confirmed Consumer Affairs Victoria is still actively pursuing Belle. We won't let up, they said. After 2015, Belle Gibson largely vanished. Then, in 2019, Belle reappeared in a way nobody saw coming. A video circulated of a woman in a traditional headscarf speaking in broken dialect, going by the name Sabantu, and describing her deep connection to Melbourne's Oromo community, an Ethiopian ethnic group. This woman was Belle Gibson. She spoke about our people and home in Ethiopia. She mentioned she had been raising money for the community. Doesn't that sound familiar? The actual president of the Australian Oromo Community Association responded immediately. He disavowed her. He said she had no connection to the community and her claims were false. After that, Belle disappeared again. Then, in early 2025, right as the Netflix dramatization of her story was drawing millions of viewers, Women's Day magazine published a report that was somehow stranger still. According to an anonymous former coworker, a woman had been working the deli counter of a Melbourne supermarket sometime between 2023 and 2024. She was passionate about food. She regularly advised customers on vegetarian alternatives, and she was warm and well-liked. She wore a name tag that said Mel. The coworker said she didn't recognize her until his final week on the job, when he looked at her and he said, "You look like Belle Gibson." Her whole face just dropped, he told the magazine. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. She just kind of freaked out a little bit. Women's Day acknowledged it could not confirm whether this woman was actually Belle Gibson. The co-worker was anonymous, and Belle has not commented. But if it was her, working under the name Mel, that would make her full working name Mel Gibson. The Washington Post named Belle one of the top 10 villains of 20. Time ran her story internationally. Donnelly and Toscano published The Woman Who Fooled the World, which became a bestseller and was later adapted by Netflix. All of these people were making money off Belle's story, and yet the fine has still not been paid, and the charities still haven't seen their money. Belle Gibson has never faced a single day of criminal prosecution. So that leaves us with why. Not just why Belle lied, but why it worked for as long as it did with as many smart people as it fooled. The easy answer is that Belle is a clever con artist who found a market and exploited it. But that doesn't fully hold up because Belle was telling people about her brain cancer in 2009. She was 17 or 18 at the time. There was no app, no Instagram empire, and no obvious financial motive for it. From adolescence, Belle had a pattern of claiming health conditions that couldn't be confirmed. Her own grandmother, when interviewed by Donnelly and Toscano, suggested that Belle had learned some of this behavior from her own mother. It's attention-seeking behavior, but it's also something really complicated and more psychological than just that. Belle's interview title, My Lifelong Struggle with the Truth, is either the most honest thing she ever said or the most convenient framing imaginable, and maybe it's both. But the harder question is, why did everybody want this story to be true? Because the people who watched Belle and downloaded her app and bought her cookbook really believed the story. Millions of people believed it. There's something almost unbearably appealing about a young person who stares down a terminal diagnosis and wins. Someone who proves that what you eat and how you live might matter more than whatever a doctor tells you. It flatters us. It tells us that we have more control than we feel like we do. And Belle was there at the right moment when Instagram was becoming the big thing. It is a place where intimacy and somebody's daily life creates the feeling of relationship. And when a person you feel like you know tells you something about themselves, you tend to believe them. And that's not unique to Belle Gibson. It's how influencer culture works, even to this day. A beautiful personal narrative about survival and transformation makes us want to believe, not fact check. Donnelly and Toscano titled their book The Woman Who Fooled the World. And that's a good title, but the world didn't just get fooled. It got fooled in part because it wanted to be fooled. Belle Gibson built an empire on the space between the story we wanted and the truth we didn't go looking for. A real child with real cancer had money raised in his name that never arrived. His mother had her family's fundraising page flooded with abuse by strangers who assumed they were part of a scam. Really sick people followed advice from someone who had never been sick at all. And Belle, who wept at the funeral for a woman who died from the disease she was faking, walked away and kept going for years. Nobody at Apple ran a background check, nobody at Penguin called a hospital, and nobody at Cosmopolitan asked to see a single scan. Even her own close friends, her own boyfriend, didn't question Belle going it alone and never really looking sick. Because the story was beautiful, and beautiful stories travel fast. As of 2025, the fine is still unpaid, the charities still haven't seen their money, and somewhere in Melbourne, a woman may or may not be going by the name Mel, advising supermarket customers of vegetarian alternatives, and her face dropping when somebody notices that she looks very familiar to Belle Gibson. Some stories don't end, they just quietly continue. And so that's the Scareful story of Belle Gibson, the wellness scammer who faked cancer. Let me know what you think in the comments. Have you ever had an experience with someone like Belle? Until next time, stay safe, stay careful, and remember, a good story isn't always a true story. Bye, guys.